Imagine you have something this cool, DSP amplifier, so an amplifier, and DSP, in one or a separate DSP, whatever you prefer. And there's a nice digital input on it. At that point, optical, Toslink. And now imagine you have a radio, a joint radio. This joint radio also has some outputs, and one of them is a coaxial digital output. So that means I need to somehow connect this coaxial output to the optical input on the DSP. There are now different options. There are various different home hi-fi adapter parts. There's also something else. And there's this here, a small stylish device produced for car hi-fi. From Audison, I'm checking it out and I'll tell you if you can work with it or not. There, it is. First we'll unbox it and see what's inside. To begin with, I had it installed before, which means I tried to pack everything inside just like it was packed, but it has definitely been used before. The device. Right at the front we find the user manual, printed in a nice color, with technical specs and all that, and a wiring diagram showing how everything connects. We'll take another look at that later. Next, we have additional mounting screws to secure the part directly in the vehicle. The corresponding cable set, that comes with it. You can also see the wire stripping here, of course. The part was already connected, but we have the plug that goes into the device and the corresponding cables. We'll take another look at the wiring layout in a moment. Currently, there is 12 volt plus, remote, ground, and 12 volt. Last but not least, of course, there's the device. This is, it looks like, it's very small. We have a connection for SPDF, Aus input jack for various devices, with ICAM potentiometer for the AUX input. And here we have the connection for the wiring harness. You can just plug it in, then it fits, and you can connect it accordingly. In the hole, there's basically a screw. To unscrew that, we need to loosen it. And we have an optical output. To connect the fiber optic cable and go into the DSP accordingly, etc. We can go in with our screws on both parts, so that the part doesn't wobble around but is nice and secure. In the end, it's a nice device. It looks really nice from the front, with the logo, and at the back it just goes away. So we've already unpacked it. And now let's take a look at the user manual a bit. I've enlarged them a bit and can now display them for you. And then we'll just talk about what we see there. What you can do with it, how you can adjust it, and so on, as you can see in the picture. There are two options. To get into the C2O, and we have one option here, through normal digital player with a digital output. There are, of course, players or radius, as you saw in my join, where you can go directly into the GINT connection. Here you can see an additional adapter, because there are also portable players, the hold. In fact, the digital output is in a jack format, and then it's converted to RCA and then continues with the RCA. Because we need an RCA anyway. To get into the C2O, the alternative to that is actually the good old analog output. Analog output from your phone or MP3 player or whatever you have there. You can connect directly with the jack-to-jack cable, both work. Not included, that means neither the RCA cable nor the jack-to-jack cable is included. You can plug it in here, and with the analog connection, we have options here again. and we have the option to use both the 4-pin connector and the 3-pin connector. So if I'm not mistaken, the 4-pin connector is actually the one you also have on your phone, because then the microphone also runs through it, which we don't need in this case. And the 3-pin connector is basically the classic one that you know from earlier, that you just plug into the Discman. You still plugged in a Discman, MP3 player and so on. In contrast to the digital signal, the analog signal is adjustable in terms of volume. For that we also have the dial here, or the adjustment pot at the C2O, and there we can adjust sensitivity from 0.1 volts to 2 volts. That means you can actually adjust your own player a bit. The most important thing is, of course, how can we operate the C2O from the outside, and there are actually 2 ways to operate it. We have one option, option 1, to connect the device just like an amplifier. That means we take the red cable and the black cable, connect these permanently to the positive and negative of the battery, or however. And then we basically go with the remote from our radio, from our DSP, from our amplifier. We actually go to the blue remote cable from the C2O. And with that, we would have connected the adapter just like an amplifier. That means always connected to positive and negative remote is set when you need it. The first option is recommended because then we actually need relatively small currents through the remote cable. That means we can work there without any additional equipment. We can go directly out from the radio. Everything's great. In the second option, the entire power that the Audison device wants is routed through the remote. It goes through remote, and then we go to the orange cable. That's the 12V remote cable. And that will then be connected only together with connected to the ground. That means we only have 2 cables connected instead of 3 cables, but that of course means we have a larger current being drawn through the remote line. And that can sometimes require too much current from the radios. And then they can no longer provide enough power for the remote from the amplifiers and so on. That's why I would recommend option 1 here. If it really can't be helped and you don't have a remote and want to go to the ignition positive, you can also go with version 2. You can then just plug all of that into the connection port here. And then you have an optical out cable, which of course is also not included. And you can then put that into your DSP, into your digital amplifier, whatever. It's quite simple. I actually have it set up now with the joint radio and a Helix DSP amplifier very easily. And I have to say, I was very, very satisfied with it. Never had problems. What else do we have? It's like this, the C2O at some point. You have to switch. That means if we have a digital input in place and an analog input, what is he supposed to do now? He can't mix the 2 signals. That means there is a switching. By default, the analog signal has a higher priority than the digital signal. And accordingly, when there is no longer an analog signal present, you can set it when it will basically switch to the digital signal. You can do that once you open the device. You set it up with the potentiometer, whether it's 6 seconds, 9 seconds, or 12 seconds. Since I never used the analog input myself, I didn't need it at all. Here we see again, when something actually happens. That means if we have a digital input and an analog input connected at the same time, exactly what I just said happens. That means the analog signal has higher priority, and the analog signal then comes out as optical. 440. That's pretty cool. If we not have an analog signal but only a digital signal going in, we can feed in a maximum of 24192, and then 24192 comes out as well. Basically, it's a nice little box that looks nice, and you can position it neatly. And when you have the corresponding equipment, a high quality digital signal converted from coaxial to optical. There are very similar devices from the hi-fi sector But every time a power supply is still necessary, every time a 12-volt adapter or a 5-volt USB adapter is necessary. And it usually doesn't have a mounting device where you can somehow secure screws. None of that is here. Everything is included here. You can just plug it in and it works without any problems. It doesn't warm, it doesn't get cold. But you can get the signal nicely into the DSP and process it properly there. If you're wondering now, do I need this thing? Because even if I don't have a DSP and just want to connect an amplifier behind it, it's difficult because I actually hardly know any amplifiers that have a digital input. There are some, yes, certainly, but there are so few that you could actually do without them in that moment. If you're wondering why I even took it out, it's quite simple. I switched the join radio and replaced it with a join radio that has a digital output. And I can tell you that I didn't hear any acoustic difference at all. That means whether I have the new radio in that has a digital, direct optical digital output, or if I had the old join radio in with coaxial in and optical out. It just makes no difference. And accordingly, it's definitely a good substitute product. If you just don't have the option, I recommend it. If you have any questions, just drop them down in the comments. Otherwise, I would be happy if you stay with me as loyal viewers. We'll see each other next week. For Thomas,